So let's have a look at how that can be done. And I'm going to offer you a series of solutions, but as you will see, they differ. They differ especially considering the time and the basicness of the changes. For instance, you have the short and middle long-term solutions. They all offer glued-on sustainability, which does not really genuinely change the system. And I must admit that in all those 30 years that I've been working on sustainable development, apart from my Omniconomics research, everything I did, improving education and etc., was all glued on sustainability. But also, for instance, the SDGs are glued on. They don't really change the system, however important they are. Look, one of the goals is to eradicate poverty, right? And another is to eradicate hunger. Okay, but nevertheless, this does not change fundamentally anything. We have to work on them. It's good that they are here, but in order to change the system fundamentally, we need much, much more. You can only see it looking at the end date. They are defined for only 15 years, starting in 2015, so ending in 2030. This is short-term related. It doesn't really change the structure. Another example is the Paris Climate Treaty and also other examples of climate agreements with an intermediate milestone in 2030 and having its final goal in 2050. And the same is true for the EU Green Plan. This has the same kind of data, so this is also short-term and middle-long-term related. Look at the colors to see what the term is. But all of these very important initiatives don't change the system fundamentally. For instance, it doesn't change anything concerning this idea that I showed you of money that attracts money. And even the circular economy, which is by many people wrongly concerned to seen as equal to sustainable development. So when we are able to integrate the circular economy into the entire economy, then we will be sustainable. Well, actually, no way. It's very important that we work on circular economy, of course, but real sustainability is much, much more than this. As I told you, all of these short or middle-long-term enterprises don't change the fundamental structure, for instance, not eradicating the fact that money will always attract money as long as we don't fundamentally change the system. And so we need more. We need a thorough redesign of the economic system, not just as an economic system, but as an integrated part of everything we humans do. That's a really difficult enterprise, so this is a long-term element. And in order to be able to do that, we have to buy time. We have to postpone our disasters. And that's why the short and middle and long-term solutions are so important. They buy us time. So at the same time, simultaneously, we can work on the long-term solution, integrating sustainability as an intrinsic element in our society and our economy. Which means that before we start changing randomly things because we don't really know what we're doing, it's very essential, it's key that we first understand economics much better than we now do. We have to eradicate the myths and the faulty words. We have to forget about all those different schools. We have to really build a theoretical fundament that represents reality. First understand, only then we act. Learning to understand, which this means that we have to develop a new science, and I've given the name Omniconomics to it. And in a short while, I will describe the characteristics of this economic science, because we can already state them. This should allow us not to again let some spontaneous evolution form our economic system. We cannot afford to do that again. We have to think and then act, which means also that we have to talk about what are the purposes, the goals of this omniconomics science. Who are the ones who are going to say what the goals are that we want to realize? For this, we need an active and participative democracy. Actually talking about the question, what kind of world do we want to live in? In other words, what exactly is a stable, sustainable world? That's a discussion that has not really been done so far, at least not with many people involved, while all people are stakeholders and have the right to participate in this discussion. Only then, if we succeed in agreeing to some extent about what kind of world we want and how to realize it, then we can create fundamental systemic change and thus realize this broad holloway that I told you about. And I think this can be done. I described it all in my book, and I hope you will be able to read it and perhaps agree with me, or at least discuss it with me. Now, let me describe this omniconomics science a bit in more detail, in which, of course, omni stands for everything, and no doubt you can see that it's a combination of omni with economics, or economics, whatever. Some characteristics. First of all, omniconomics is not just about people and their goods. This is what the neoclassical schools claim, making use of their homo economicus, which we cannot use anymore, of course. It's also not just about institutions, as the institutional economic schools claim, and it's not just about classes, which is the claim by the Marxist schools. Actually, it's about all of that and much more. This omniconomics should recognize the fact that our system, which is not just an economic system, but it's a human and actually a natural system, is a complex system. So we should quit all this oversimplification and become real. Here's more. Omniconomics is to include economics, but also elements of ecology, psychology, sociology, politicology, etc. In other words, it is definitely going to be an interdisciplinary science. It has to be complete. In other words, it should deal with a closed system, and this is something that I should explain a bit more perhaps. I talked to you about the externalities, which are things outside of the economic system as it is considered to be, which means that, well, if you have externalities, then you have the risk of destroying the system or leaving it in such a state that future generations cannot really live in it, whatever. So if you have externalities, this shows that the system is not large enough, and you should expand the system, including those externalities, for instance, including nature within the system. And then, next, if you still perhaps have externalities, you should increase the system even more, expanding it until there are no externalities whatsoever. Then, only then, you have a closed system, And then you can build a true science without the risk of destroying things. It also puts the self-invented human ownership of the planet into perspective, recognizing that we are not the owners of the planet, but we are living elements of this planet together with all kinds of other species and etc. In other words, it is to make us a genuine part of the biosphere of our planet. In other words, Omniconomics is not just a humanity, social science. It's much more than a social science. But at the same time, it's also not just an exact science. It should design its own methods. It should not copycat the methods of existing sciences. Every science has to design its own way of thinking and experimenting, etc. It also needs the active involvement of society in the form of a participative democracy. This is to set the direction, to define the goals, together with scientists, of course, which means that actually Omniconomics is not only an interdisciplinary science, it's also a transdisciplinary science in which people from many disciplines work together with groups and individuals in society together, working in a harmonious way. It also, of course, it stands to reason. It's insane that I have to mention this, but nevertheless it should happen. It has to be critical, which means that each and every theory or hypothesis or model is to be solidly and continuously empirically tested through thousands of repeated experiments, thus eradicating all those crazy myths that economics nowadays has. In other words, finally, first think and then act. Now, in my book, I investigated how the various sciences came into being. And what I noticed, starting with physics and astronomy in the 17th century and going through chemistry and biology and many other disciplines, I found out that there's a pattern that can be found every time. The first step is always the discovery or the invention of new physical tools, and I'll give you an example of those. Here you have some elements of the 16th and 17th century that were used in astronomy. I won't explain them, they are shown in the book as well, so if you want to know more, just have a look there. But nowadays we also have a lot of new physical tools, and this is just one example. Of course, you know about computers and the internet and everything, but here also you have an example for the health science. You probably recognize the MRI apparatus on the left, and although the man who is lying down there is not me, actually the brain that is shown on the right is my personal brain, which was photographed in an MRI installation when a few years ago I participated as a volunteer in a scientific experiment. And so here you have some fantastic new physical tools, but also we can make use of new mental tools. Again, I start with a few traditional ones. This, for instance, is a new mental tool, a kind of math. This was actually a new math designed by Isaac Newton, who was considered to be the father of physics in the 17th century. This image was taken from one of his books. So mathematics is an example of such a new mental tool, and in later centuries, for instance, probability calculus was one, and statistics was one. Here are some examples of our present time, all new mental tools. So as you can see, we have many of them nowadays, which will all be helpful to design this new science of omniconomics. Next, new patterns. It's always the case that new patterns are a strong step towards new science, and this is a famous example of the periodic table of elements. And the picture shows you the state it was in 1869, as it was designed by Mendeleev, and the black boxes are additions in some later years. And nowadays, it's all been filled up. It's actually complete. Where this is an old example from the 19th century, well, here is a new example from now. And in this example, you can see two images that show some resemblance. The first on the left are a few neurons in a rat brain. Okay, it's a rat brain, but it might just as well have been a human brain because the principle is the same. All those clusters are neurons, brain cells, and all the wires between them are the connections, the neurons and the axons that connect the system. And on the right, you have a small portion of the internet, which is a totally different thing, but nevertheless there's a great resemblance, and this is the basis for network theory, which is an important new approach to science nowadays. New words. First, again, a few existing words. I just took a few rather arbitrarily. It doesn't matter because it just gives you some examples. And here are words that we can use right now. Words like emergence and attractors are taken from complexity theory. Homeostasis, for instance, is taken from biology, etc. Well, you can see virtual reality taken from the information technology. And then there are two green terms which are new because I designed them and I described them in my book on economics. You will find them there: intrinsic sustainability and also survival of the sustainablest. Then steps 5 and 6 are to be taken simultaneously because I already mentioned the new narrative of the broad Holloway, and if this can be realized, then we have as a major success an intrinsically sustainable world. Now, I don't have the time to go into the details, perhaps in the next lecture somewhere else. I will be able to find the time to explain this path in more detail. But for now, I'll have to leave it at that. So I won't talk about steps 7 and 8. And now, perhaps you may think, how realistic is this all? Isn't this a pipe dream? Is this just a fantasy? Well, first of all, let me show you the 3 laws of the famous science fiction writer and scientist Arthur C. Clarke. His first law: when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. Well, let me point out to you that probably I can be considered to be an elderly scientist, and I think that it is possible to create omniconomics and then to create an intrinsically sustainable world. And so probably I'm right, according to Arthur C. Clarke. The second law states, the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And then there's the third law. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And you can see this not only as technology, but also advanced economics. Well, that is to say, omniconomics. It may be perhaps appear to be indistinguishable from magic. In other words, magic is possible. We've shown it already. So, is it really true that it's possible to create such an intrinsically sustainable world, realizing this broad whole way? Well, I have to add one more law, which is my own first law. Only when it succeeds, you know whether it's possible. In other words, as long as it hasn't been realized, you can never say that it's impossible. And my conclusion is, okay, let's try it. Let's do it. Let's make it. But then, of course, we need experts from many disciplines in cooperation with society. Here's a brief summary of the final chapters of my book, which I cannot explain right now because it would take too much time. But as I said, perhaps in the next lecture I will be able to do it, and you can always read the book. My proposal is to perform long series of experiments in virtual reality, for instance, in online games with very many participants, so-called MORGs, which stands for massively multiplayer online role-playing games, containing a self-learning omniconomic system in which emerges spontaneously survival of the sustainables, thanks to which, based on numerous virtual observations, we discover patterns and design theories which then are tested in the real world. This is a brief summary of my proposal, which you can learn about in many details in the book, and I really hope that you will read it and you will probably agree with me. So finally, the question, what can you do? As you can see, there are several groups. First, everyone, which includes citizens, businesses, organizations, education, government, etc. You can, of course, first read the book and then talk about it and involve others. You can also watch the video clips on YouTube and on the website study the appendices, as many as you like. There are 28 appendices describing the deeper, fundamental scientific and science philosophical details of this whole story. Here are just a few examples. I already showed you the image below about money attracting money. You can find the video clip of this on YouTube, but you can also download the computer program and experiment with such processes yourself. And on top, you can see another example of a computer program that you can also use. In other words, you can play with those mathematical models and the computer programs, etc. You can organize presentations and discussion meetings. I promise you, if you organize it in a good way, I will come, either physically or online. You can perhaps help to set up an organization, because probably if we want to create a very much alive Omniconomics, both in science, in universities and other centers of expertise, and in society, discussing this question of what kind of world do we actually want to live in, then we may need some kind of organization. And perhaps this can be inserted into an existing organization, I'm not sure, but otherwise we can see if an association or a foundation or whatever can be formed, and if you feel like that, you may want to help setting this up. And for this same purpose, you may want to contribute financially to the organization, either yourself or perhaps you are very good at crowdfunding, and then you can help in that way. Let's go to the education, especially the universities. Here are some possibilities. Students can perform research at the BSc or MSc or perhaps even the PhD level. If you are going to do some kind of research, for instance, for your thesis, please investigate if you can do something with the economics model, either with some detail. Perhaps you can find one of the 28 appendices that appeals to you and that you want to do more investigation on, or perhaps you can take all of economics as your study object and do research and write about it. The same, of course, is true for educators, for researchers. Please see what you can do in this respect. You may also want to design and implement a minor in your study program. If so, I'll be happy to assist you if you want. And of course, you can invite me for guest lectures. I will definitely do that. And specifically for economics education, you may broaden it and you may deepen it. Broaden, that is to say, please pay attention to more than just the neoclassical model. Also illustrate your education with other economic schools, so the students will learn that there is more than just this one direction in economics currently. And deepen it, that is to say, see if you can use elements of Omniconomics in your education so that your students will be able to look further on in time and in philosophy. Also, perhaps you can have a look at the appendices that I placed online, the 28 appendices, offering more depth in the scientific direction and the science philosophical direction, and you may consider to expand appendices. This would also be, for instance, a nice task for students for their thesis. You can even consider to write new appendices, deepening some other fields in the field of Omniconomics. But of course, always, if you consider doing this, please first contact me. For the media and the marketeers and the communication experts, there's also a nice task to be performed. Bring Omniconomics to the attention of many. Make plans for that. See what you can do. And then for the politicians and the CEOs, discuss Omniconomics, for instance, in scientific institutes of the political parties. Integrate Omniconomics in the mission, the philosophy, or the party program. Now, finally, I have to show, for legal reasons, the photo credits. Otherwise, people may not be happy if I use their photograph. I'm obliged to do this, and I'm happy to do this, of course, because in this way I honor those who made the photographs. Let's return to this. This is what you can do, and I invite you all to think about it and to contact me if you have some ideas or proposal in this respect. I first show you my webpage on which you can find a lot of interesting elements. I thank you.